you should probably go to Denmark. But as well as, I hope I've convinced you now not only that income inequality is linked to a wide range of health and social problems, and the differences between more and less equal countries are very large. Since we wrote our book and developed this broader picture of the damage of inequality, other disciplines and other academic researchers have really started to look at other kinds of outcomes as well. And in particular, developmental economists and development experts are concerned about how much inequality slows economic growth for those countries that's still needed. For low and middle income countries, high inequality is linked to more economic instability, and those countries are less able to make the developmental strides that they need to improve the health and well-being of their whole populations. So I'm going to hand back to Richard at this point to finish up with talking. Oh, well, I'm not going to say what you're going to say. You can say it for yourself.
Good, okay. Well, although we've shown data just for the richer countries, with a few exceptions, I hope the few exceptions are enough to show you that the same forces related to inequality are at work at all levels of development. And there are hundreds of research papers in peer-reviewed journals looking at health, population health in relation to income inequality. There are a large number looking at levels of violence in relation to inequality. And they confirm that these relationships work at all levels of development. The difference is that in countries that are less developed, it's still important to have rises in the absolute standard of living. Less developed countries do still need economic growth. The rich countries no longer benefit very much from having more economic growth. The relationships that Kate has shown you have all been cross-sectional, with the exception of the one on child well-being, where she showed you the change in child well-being are related to the changes in inequality. However, as I say, there is a lot more research we were trying to demonstrate a set of relationships as simply and clearly as possible. Our book wasn't important because it showed new evidence. It was important because it summarized very simply a picture that had been coming together in the epidemiology. The first papers on the effects of income inequality on health were published in the late 1970s, and similarly the first papers on violence and inequality. So this is really a summary of a picture that has been emerging over 35 years, something like that. It's not something that depends just on the evidence in our book, though our critics have often treated it as if our evidence is all there is, although we have, I think, 400 and something footnotes. People have looked, for instance, at changes over time. So when you get a rise in inequality, the top graph is the marginal changes. So after about 3 years, you start seeing a deterioration in health. And the lower panel is the cumulative effect of a rise in inequality over subsequent years. Most of the time, the changes in inequality from year to year are small, which means that instead of the background rise in life expectancy that seems to happen all the time, instead of it cancelling that out, what it means is the background rate of improvement in life expectancy is a bit slower than it would have been. Or if inequality falls, it's a bit faster than it would have been. But it looks as if the effects of inequality on health start to come through after about 3 years and accumulate until maybe 12 years later. The time lags are probably different for each of the outcomes. But the picture we're showing you is really, and now we can compare, at least for some countries, levels of mental illness or drug abuse or whatever with measures of income inequality, it really is simply confirming the picture that many people have recognized for centuries at an intuitive level. And since before the French Revolution, I think many people have recognized that inequality is divisive and socially corrosive. And that is really what the data confirms. It shows that those relationships are truer than we ever imagined. As well as looking at changes over time, there are a number of papers that have controlled for individual income or individual education. So many of them using data from the few countries that have income on the census. So you can take a population and you can know the incomes of every person in that population. And you can predict the death rates based on your knowledge of incomes. And then you can also see whether there is an additional contextual effect of inequality after you've taken into account the individual incomes or education. And there was a meta-analysis of those multi-level models published in the British Medical Journal, came from people at the Harvard School of Public Health who've done a lot of this work. They've made an important contribution to this field. I want to go on now to say something about who is affected by inequality. Kate, in several of the graphs, pointed out the scale of the differences in performance between more and less equal countries. In one graph, she showed you that homicide rates were 10 times as high in the more unequal American states as the more equal Canadian provinces. If you looked at the vertical axis on the teenage birth rate graph, you'd see tenfold differences in levels of in teenage births between more and less equal countries. Or the imprisonment graph, 10 times the proportion of the population imprisoned in the more unequal societies. And so you get this situation where in some American states, they were spending more on prisons than on higher education. And you get into bizarre problems like that. And in Britain, we've had a huge rise in prison populations while our crime rates actually fell. And all the expenses that go with that. But these differences are sometimes so large, I know not all as large. The differences in, for instance, mental illness, only 2 or 3 times as much, or in infant mortality, only 2 or 3 times as much in more unequal societies. But the differences, anyway, are often large because it isn't just the poor who are being affected by inequality. I showed you much earlier on that histogram, set of light blue histograms of life expectancy in small areas of England and Wales, a gradient right across society, showing we were all part of that picture of health inequalities. We are all part of this picture of the effects of greater or lesser inequality. Fortunately, you don't have to just infer that we're all affected from that kind of argument, because there's some research papers where you can compare people at each level in the social hierarchy between more and less equal societies. This is a very old paper where we were getting interested in whether health inequalities, the social class differences in health, were just as big in each country or whether they were smaller in some than in others. And some Swedish researchers classified all their infant deaths by the British social occupational class classification. The classification is by father's occupation, so perhaps anachronistically single mothers have to go in their own group. Then here are infant deaths where the father is an unskilled manual worker. There are semi-skilled manual workers, skilled manual, junior clerical workers, intermediate non-manual, people like teachers and nurses, and at the top, directors of larger companies, universities, professors, doctors, lawyers, people like that. But you see, the English the England and Wales infant mortality is higher right across the society at all levels. And the Swedish one, Sweden being a more equal country, lower infant mortality right the way across. The differences are biggest at the bottom, but even at the top, there seems to be some advantage in living in a more equal society. We have a number of sources of data that show that same pattern, and they've accumulated in the research since we published our book. So I imagine now 10 or 12 examples of this that we've come across, which show that the social gradient is steeper in more unequal societies. This is an example of children's or young people's literacy scores. So the literacy scores of people aged 16 to 25 years old in Sweden, Canada, and the United States. And here they're classified not by the social class, but by the level of education of their parents. So at this end, on the right, you've got the children of highly educated people. They've had 13, 14, 15, 16 years education. And at the bottom, parents nearer the lower down on the social hierarchy who've only had 5, 6, 7, 8 years education. And what you see is that the gradient is shallower in Sweden. It makes less difference. Just as in the social mobility graph, your parents' income made less difference to where you ended up. Here, your parents' education makes less difference to your performance. You do better all the way across society in that more equal society than Canada, which is intermediate in terms of income inequality, a slightly steeper gradient, and the most unequal, United States, the steepest gradient of those. These graphs, that one and the previous one, are not showing you whether there are more unskilled workers in one country than another, or more people with badly educated parents in one country than another. They're saying wherever you come, you do better if you're in a more equal country. Again, the differences are biggest at the bottom, but even at the top, it looks as if there's a slight benefit of being in a more equal society. Now, we're always being asked to say that even the super rich would do better if they lived in a more equal society. We don't have data on them. And obviously there's violence and drug problems and mental illness and ill health at the top. They're all more common at the bottom, but we don't know if you take the 1%, the richest 1%, or the 10th of the 1%, we don't have the data on mental illness or health problems amongst those people. But we can say 90 or 95% of us would seem to do better in a more equal society. And that is not because of the direct income effects. It's about where our income is in relation to others. So, this was the summary picture that Kate showed you early on. I think people are often surprised that so many different problems seem to be related to this one thing, income inequality. It becomes easier to understand when you remember, as Kate said early on, that these are all problems with social gradients. In a sense, what we are saying is simply that problems that we know are related to social status within our societies, you all know where violence is worst in what part of the city and so on, and where health is worst. It's always the poorest areas. But what we're saying is the problems related to social status within our societies get worse when you increase the social status differences. And the sort of simple view, if we're not going to spend time on the causal processes that we discuss in our book, is that what income inequality does is it makes more powerful all the ways in which class and status imprint themselves on us as individuals throughout our lives, affecting educational performance, affecting health and everything else. Rather than thinking of income inequality as a sort of new influence on all these things, you should think of it as telling you more about the effects of social class. Really, whether we live in a very hierarchical society like that or a much shallower social hierarchy like that. And if you live in the shallower society, which it is, affects the quality of social relationships. How much trust there is up and down the social hierarchy. What Kate was telling you about imprisonment, the harsher sentencing, shows that in more unequal societies, I don't know whether it's more fear up and down the social hierarchy or less empathy, but again, it's an indication that something is going wrong with the quality of social relationships in that society. So I think of inequality, the material differences in wealth and in income, as, if you like, the framework or scaffold round which all the cultural markers of social status are built. You know, the things that determine what part of town you live in, what sort of education you've had, what kind of job you do, all these different outcomes, the clothes you wear, the books you read, the films you see, all the things to do with taste. And of course, sociologists have often pointed out the way in which we use money to express social position. I often think when people talk about a sort of ideal of creating a classless society, it's something that several prime ministers have said after winning an election in Britain. They've stood on the steps of number 10 Downing Street in London and said they wanted to create a classless society. Conservative prime ministers have said that, but without any recognition that you can't do that without reducing the material differences between us. This is, I said we were going to talk about the psychosocial effects of inequality rather than the direct material effects on people having poor diets and so on. Since we wrote our book, a very important paper has come out looking at a whole range of mental illnesses, which they say, and personality disorders, which they go through vast quantities of evidence showing that they are related to what they call the dominance behavioral system. Suggestion that humans, like many other animals, have a module of the brain for dealing with issues to do with social status and social hierarchy. I think to understand these relationships, you need to understand monkey dominance hierarchies, perhaps more than you need to understand Marx. You know, I really think that this is about our evolved psychology. That is what explains why income differences that create the ranking system have such powerful effects on us and our sensitivity to it. I thought I should at least show one slide of where Mexico is in relation to other countries. I don't think the measures of income inequality are at all reliable in some of these countries, but they can't be too far of the mark because, and if you look at top there with the most unequal incomes is South Africa. Look at its health in relation to its GDP per capita or its levels of violence, and they're just what you'd expect from the inequality. Mexico comes rather too far up the scale. It's there. South Africa, Brazil, Chile, India, Russia, Mexico, Indonesia, Turkey, China, and then you start getting the European countries, Eastern Europe, and going through to the ones that we've been showing you. So on the basis of what we've been talking about, you would expect a huge range of additional social problems in these countries because they have such much bigger income differences. again, from the perhaps rather unreliable data, it does look as if income differences have been declining in most South American countries between 2000 and 2010. I don't know whether that's true since then, but a number of papers seem to come to the same conclusion. Mexico is here. In that period, that decade, you decreased your inequality by a small amount. The annual percentage change in inequality, just over 1% reduction in inequality during that decade. Here you've got Ecuador, El Salvador, Argentina, Peru, Venezuela, Mexico, Brazil. So a general tendency perhaps towards declining inequality in South America, but from very high levels of inequality. I want to say a little bit about what the big drivers of inequality are. I think if you look at many of the papers written by economists, they're quite misleading because they tend to measure the things that you can measure in terms of numbers, looking at technical change and immigration and globalization and things like that. But if you look at the long sweep of inequality, here you've got it just for a few rich countries, but it's also true for India and many other countries. The pattern is that you have high inequality until somewhere around 1930. And then inequality comes sliding down. And it finishes its decline in the 1970s. And then from about 1980, you get the modern rise of inequality. That's a very general common pattern. And you find it in, as I say, in Sweden and in India, as well as these countries. I suggest to you that that is the strengthening and then the weakening of the whole labor, socialist, social democratic movement, the strength of trade unions and so on in these different countries. What I call the countervailing voice in society. And as that weakened around the late 1970s and 1980, neoliberal thinking comes in and becomes dominant. And it's then that you get the rise of inequality that's taken us right back to levels of inequality that we hadn't seen since early in the 20th century. Another thing that confirms, I think, that pattern, that it is about the strength of the countervailing voice in society, is that if you look at the strength of trade unions in different countries, there's a very close relationship with inequality. So this is data for 16 OECD countries between 1966 and 1994. So each dot is a country at a particular date, and it's showing the percentage of the population in trade unions, the percentage of the labor force in trade unions. So down here you've got 10 or 20% of the population in trade unions, and up there you've got 70, 80 or 90% in trade unions. And the higher the percentage of the population in trade unions, the lower the inequality. And you can look at that as well over time. I've seen these graphs for a lot of different countries now. This is the income inequality that I showed you earlier for the United States. So it comes tumbling down early in the century, and then it goes on up from about 1980 onwards. Trade union strength does exactly the opposite. I don't think that's because trade unions are the only important thing. I don't think it's just because they help their members' incomes. I think that the trade union membership is an indication of the strength of what I'm calling the countervailing voice in society, a challenge to the neoliberal ideology, if you like, an idea of another way of running society, another kind of analysis. And what has happened in so many countries is not that the poor have fallen further behind the middle, but that the rich have run further ahead of the middle. So this looks at income differences within the biggest 350 American companies. And again, these trends are quite widespread, perhaps more pronounced in the United States. This graph is showing you the difference in the income between the CEO in each of the 350 biggest American companies and the average production worker. And you can see in, there's 1980, the CEOs in these companies were getting about, 30, 35 times what the average production worker got. But by the first decade this century, they were getting 10 times as much. They were getting 200, 300, or 400 times as much as the average production worker. I suggest to you that that is because that the bonus culture shows a lack of any democratic constraint. The people at the top were free under neoliberal thinking and weak trade unions to do what they like. And I think that the way of dealing with that problem is to strengthen the democratic constraints within the economy. And there are two ways really of reducing income differences. One is you start off with big difference in market incomes and you redistribute with high taxes and generous benefits, and you close the gap that way. That's how many of the Scandinavian countries do it. But there are also examples of countries that start off with smaller differences in market incomes before taxes. And I think that's a more fundamental way of dealing with inequality. And I suggest that we've got to pursue all forms of greater economic democracy, all the ways we can. And one of them is to have law requiring employee representatives on the boards of companies. About half the members of the European community, the European Union, have legislation requiring employee representatives on company boards. It's often very weak, but in some countries like Germany, it's quite strong. In Britain, we have no legislation like that. Countries with that kind of legislation, they do seem to have a smaller rise in inequality, and the companies with employee representatives on their boards have smaller income differences. But we can go much further, and I think should go much further than that. We should try and grow the employee-owned sector of the economy. That helps not only to redistribute income, but it redistributes wealth. It redistributes unearned income. My view, I suppose, is that the next great step in human emancipation is to extend democracy into the economic sphere in any ways we can. I think that there are many ways of doing that, but we should feel confident about that possibility because there are now many evaluations, academic research papers, comparing more democratic companies with less democratic ones.